We're going to start with our focus on Halifax, where Canada's provincial leaders are meeting in a year that's been fraught with discontent towards the federal government. On the carbon tax, more provinces than ever are against it. On housing, premiers say Ottawa won't stay in its lane. And on delays in healthcare or childcare, the two sides continue to trade blame. Here are just a few of the premiers venting their frustration.
What we see is a federal government that's trying to essentially go into our bank account and garnish money, take money out of our bank account.
We are very open in Newfoundland and Labrador to working with the federal government, but we don't work for the federal government.
We are wanting to draw some clear jurisdictional boundaries.
All the premiers together, I think they're pretty frustrated.
Joining us now from Halifax is David Eby. He is, of course, the Premier of British Columbia. Premier Eby, good to see you. Thank you for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me, David.
You heard a lot of the frustration there of your colleagues. You said today you're frustrated that core federal responsibilities are going unaddressed while they do things in your jurisdiction. What has that meant for your province?
Well, for us in British Columbia, we're grappling with record high in migration to the province. We added 180,000 people to the province just in the last year. That brings with us some significant obligations around things like healthcare, infrastructure, and housing. And our challenge has been really getting the federal government, getting their attention on the need for those critical investments that accompany their decision to significantly ramp up immigration. And that's just one example. I think the federal government could have really avoided a lot of the unhappiness that's around the table right now if we'd had the opportunity, and I think the premiers are going to call for it again, for the Prime Minister just to come and sit with the premiers and to work through a few of these issues. Not all of them are about money. Some of them are just about better coordination.
Better coordination, but you do have issues at the table there, Premier, where Scott Moe, for example, is withholding the carbon tax that he's supposed to collect and remit to the federal government, and yet the premiers are complaining about the federal government not respecting jurisdiction. How do we move past that when you've got such blatant disagreements between the premiers and the Prime Minister here?
If I had one simple prescription for the Prime Minister, it would just be to sit down at the table with the premiers. And it doesn't matter whether it's around coordination in the healthcare system, around immigration, around infrastructure, you name it. But coming to the table will enable that conversation to start that is just not happening right now. And we're on the front lines, in British Columbia, bringing the information to the Prime Minister about the challenges related to housing, about the infrastructure needs we have that are leading to traffic jams and backups and delays in our trade that are costing the economy. There are coordination pieces that are $0 items that relate to the federal government's role and where it overlaps with the provincial government that I know we can do better on. And we can't do it in just bilateral meetings. It involves the whole table of the premiers working together with the federal government. And I think there is willingness to do that. But things have really built up a head of steam. And some of that pressure would be let off simply by a show of goodwill, sitting at the table and having those conversations with us. Like, for example, today we heard there's going to be a transit announcement of some kind, federal transit. We've been calling for that for a long time from the federal government. Nobody knows what the content of the announcement is. Nobody knows how the fund will be structured. Nobody knows whether it's about capital or operating expenses. These are all things that we should have been talking about in advance so that we could help them use those tax dollars that all Canadians pay for in the most effective way possible.
Okay, you mentioned immigration and the population challenges you're facing in British Columbia, and I know you've raised this issue before because a lot of money went to Quebec from the federal government to deal with the particular challenges they have had. They're dealing with asylum seekers in Quebec. You're dealing with more regular immigration in British Columbia. Are they really the same thing when you break it down?
Well, I think there's no question that Quebec and Ontario are facing some really profound challenges around accommodating refugee claimants in their provinces. And that is different than the issue British Columbia is facing. We are seeing a rising number of asylum seekers. But this is a really great example of some of the concern that we have. So Quebec gets $750 million to assist with this challenge. This is a program that was not available for British Columbia to access any dollars. We have thousands of migrants that need support in British Columbia. I'm not saying British Columbia needs the same amount of money as Quebec, but British Columbians help send $13 billion a year in equalization payments to Quebec already. And then Quebec is able to access special programs that British Columbia is not able to access. Ontario is able to access hospital funding that British Columbia is not able to access. They're able to access battery plant funding that British Columbia is not able to access. And we're also sending equalization money to Ontario. All we're asking for is fair treatment. If there's a program for Quebec, if there's a program for Ontario, that we get to participate on a per capita basis, a per migrant basis, a per British Columbian basis, whatever the basis is of the funding, just fair treatment for British Columbia. We don't think that's too much to ask, given that we're paying equalization to both of those provinces.
Okay, I just want to touch on a couple of things there. Equalization, I know not every province benefits from equalization, but it comes out of federal tax revenue. It's not like your government pays into a pot. I appreciate your point that it's all one taxpayer and it goes into the central government, and because your economy is above a certain standard, you don't qualify for it. But it speaks to, I think, a frustration that you touched on there, Premier, with the electric vehicle battery plant investments. You raised this when the Western and Northern premiers met a while back. Have you spoken to Doug Ford or Francois Legault about your concerns that they are getting the lion's share of these big transformative industrial developments while British Columbia is not?
Well, British Columbians are struggling with affordability, just like Canadians right across Canada. Mm-hmm. And so it does matter to us when we pay into a federal pool that is then distributed to other provinces that we don't have access to. And that's what equalization is. It makes zero sense that Ontario is accessing $1 billion in equalization over the last 2 years. And so the program is not fulfilling its purpose, which is ensuring a minimum level of service. How it can be that Ontario gets this money and then it makes decisions to like buy the beer store contract out, whatever. That's not what equalization is about. It's about, do you have access to a good school? Do you have access to a good hospital? And so that program does need to be revisited. But in terms of those big blockbuster deals that the federal government has been signing with Quebec and Ontario on these massive battery plants, we have huge opportunities in BC around hydrogen, around biofuels, around critical minerals. These are massive multi-billion-dollar opportunities for our province. We don't have electric car manufacturing in British Columbia. We have different opportunities, and we do need that recognition from the federal government that this needs to be distributed right across Canada when they're doing economic initiatives like this. It can't be just focused because Ottawa's in Ontario, that's front of mind. They're waking up every day in Ontario. They're thinking about Ontario. They have to think nationally in these programs, and we don't think that's too much to ask.
Look, as a guy who grew up in Newfoundland and Labrador, I understand your frustration as someone who lives on the edge of the country, seeing what happens in the middle of the country. But are they pouring this money into Ontario and Quebec for this sector because it's right there, or is it because that's where that industry is based historically and where those companies want to go? I mean, have you had discussions with the feds about all of the energy initiatives, for example, that you just outlined about hydrogen and biofuels on a federal role in those programs?
Well, as a Newfoundlander, you'll appreciate this. We're closely aligned with Newfoundland Premier Andrew Furey on this. We've raised this issue around the cough table with our colleagues, including directly with Quebec and Ontario. Newfoundland's brought their challenge to the equalization program in the courts. They've invited us to be a part of that, and that's something we're having a look at. We're advancing those conversations here. And yes, this is something that I have raised with the federal government directly on multiple occasions. I really dislike being put in this position because it feels like grievance politics. But it's when we look just at the straight numbers of what's coming to BC compared with other provinces, and I started from a place saying, look, we're going to fly to Ottawa, we're going to be in the federal government's face, we're going to make sure those relationships are strong so they're thinking about BC all the time, and we did a lot of work to that end, and the results, unfortunately, speak for themselves. It was not a successful approach. So now we're involved in a far more public advocacy for BC's fair share on a per capita basis, which we think is a reasonable ask. We don't want to be involved in this. Federal government, when you introduce programs, is very straightforward. Just make sure every province has access to it at a minimum on a per capita basis.
Did you raise this with Premiers Ford and Legault, though? I mean, you mentioned that Doug Ford gets $1 billion in equalization, and then he spends $1 billion to accelerate the privatization of alcohol sales in Ontario. Have you discussed that at the Premier's table?
I have shared around the cough table and directly with premiers my concerns about the equalization program, that we're working with Newfoundland on this. I don't have any interest in spreading them. And frankly, I don't. You know what? If Premier Legault and Premier Ford can get more out of the federal government because of they've pursued a strategy that was more effective for them, then good for them. That's not their fault. My concern is with the federal government that enables this. that looks at the equalization program and says Ontario has benefited by $1 billion in the last 2 years, paid for by provinces other than Ontario, and we're also going to give them all of these other programs and initiatives. Like, you know, we have a huge number of Indigenous people that would benefit from a new hospital in northern British Columbia. There is no northern British Columbia Indigenous hospital program in our province. But there is one in Ontario, apparently. There is no migrant funding program in British Columbia, but there is one in Quebec, apparently. And there's no multi-billion-dollar economic initiative in BC like there is in Alberta, in Quebec, and Ontario. So that's my issue with the federal government, and that's the message I'm trying really hard to deliver.
Well, I mean, you're making it very clear to me right now, but Premier, I wonder, how do we square this message that if you're doing it for these provinces, you should do it for British Columbia, with the letter that Tim Houston sent on behalf of all of the premiers saying, essentially, butt out of our jurisdiction and stay in your lane? Or do you want an all-in or an all-out approach? I mean, how do we reconcile these views?
So the message can be, I guess, interpreted a number of ways. But the concern around the cough table is when there are multi-provincial programs that the federal government's dealing with, for example, municipalities instead of dealing at the provincial level, and which is okay, I guess, for the cities. But at the provincial level, we have our own programs that can coordinate really well with federal programs. So, for example, on housing infrastructure, how the federal government is choosing to distribute that infrastructure money among individual cities is potentially quite different from how the provinces would do it based on our own initiatives and our own funding. So that's the coordination we're talking about. That's what we're talking about. Why are you doing the administration? That's the province's role. If you want to fund infrastructure, do it the way federal governments have done it for generations. Send the money for the infrastructure, and the provinces will distribute it in the way that's most effective. And that is the way that's worked for a long time. And to be blunt, it does not work to have two separate infrastructure programs, a provincial one and a federal one, with different cities and different targets and different applications, because there's only one city that applies for it. It's more bureaucracy, it's more cost for taxpayers because the city has to hire additional people to apply for it and to meet the requirements of different programs.
Okay, Premier Eby, I have one last question for you before I let you go, and it has to do with a favorite topic of mine, and it's BC wine. You've got a deal with Alberta that will see BC wineries able to sell more freely back into Alberta after a dispute between the two provinces. How did you and Daniel Smith cut this deal? What does it mean?
Premier Smith had a minister who was, I think, rightly concerned that BC wineries were shipping into Alberta without paying markup. The response was to stop those shipments into Alberta. That's devastating for BC wineries. A lot of the biggest fans of BC wine do live in Alberta, and our BC wineries are struggling. There have been huge swings in temperature that decimated their vines, and so I was able to elevate it to the Premier's level. We worked together. We had some hardworking MLAs, Rolly Russell and Harwinder Sandhu, that advocated for this. And thank you to Premier Smith and her team. We were able to reach a resolution to this issue. We've got way more important stuff to work on with Alberta. And the wineries are ready to pay the markup. They want to pay the markup. And now we've got a system where they'll be able to do that.
Okay, well, Premier David Eby, federalism can work when provinces cooperate on the important things. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We'll talk to you again soon.
That certainly would be my message. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Premier. Andrew Furey is the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, and he joins me now. Premier, it's good to see you. Thanks for taking the time.
No problem, David. Always good to chat.
So, Premier, tell me why, with all the issues facing the country right now, the premiers are focusing so hard on jurisdiction and telling the federal government to stop doing what it's been doing.
Well, it's not so much that we're telling them to stop doing what it's doing. We're asking them to take a more collaborative approach, respecting the confines and the parameters of the Constitution. There is much concern about jurisdictional creep and blurring of boundaries, and we just think that it's appropriate to remind the federal government about constitutional responsibilities. And look, David, I'm anxious and wanting to work with the federal government, but make no mistake, I don't work for the federal government. We want to have an open working relationship. We've shown evidence of that in the past. In fact, we've shown how collaboration can actually get things done, like on childcare. But not collaborating and not working together and blurring jurisdictional lines and causing overreach causes confusion, and I would argue leads to inefficient and ineffective use of policy instruments and funds. And if you take an example like school lunch. It's something that we all support. I support. We already have a program in place in Newfoundland and Labrador, but we want to work with, not wake up one morning and hear that the federal government has all of a sudden decided to do school lunch programs. We want to work with them to ensure that we can achieve the goals, the common goals.
But isn't the school lunch program, isn't that just an example of a case of where the money is just going to flow into the existing programs that exist in the different provinces? I mean, I'm reading an article from 2023 where Nova Scotia says they can't launch a school lunch program in their province until they get money from the federal government. So isn't that really just what this is, rather than a full-blown intrusion?
I don't think so. I can't speak to Nova Scotia's issues, but I can say in Newfoundland and Labrador, we had already put forward a 2-year plan for school lunch and for school breakfast programs across the province, not only providing grocery supplies to the schools, but also infrastructure for the kitchens around the schools and the schools around our province. So my concern is using fiscal instruments to achieve shape-shifting of the constitutional obligations and lines that were drawn, and therefore reshaping in some way, in shape or form, responsibilities, which are put in place on purpose to ensure that those are protected and there is a clear line of sight of responsibilities and who has jurisdiction. Again, want to work with, but won't work for, want to collaborate, and I think that that's what Canadians expect. Canadians expect different levels of government to work together and collaborate to achieve a common vision that's important for Canadians.
But you know, you hear here in Ottawa, Premier, you know, from federal officials that jurisdiction becomes is convenient for premiers at times. When they're looking for money from the federal government, they're willing to bend a little bit. But when they are getting cut out of a process or maybe not getting political credit, that's when they start drawing these lines. And you look at the situation the country is in housing now, where there hasn't been enough housing stock. This is the sort of thing that is provincial jurisdiction constitutionally, but it's kind of taken the feds to come in with money to get cities to rewrite the rules to speed things up. So what's wrong with that if it's solving a problem?
You hit the nail on the head. To work with cities. I would argue in our jurisdiction in Newfoundland and Labrador, we would like to work with the federal government. We would like to collaborate with the federal government to achieve efficiencies and effectiveness of scale and financial support, so that our smaller communities, and Newfoundland and Labrador has small communities that can't necessarily access and work with the complicated federal system. It is provincial jurisdiction. If they want to come in and offer fiscal support, we'd be happy to work with them to ensure that it is used effectively. So I don't really see that as competing interests. I think that could be something that different levels of government can work together. I continue to point back to David to childcare. I mean, Newfoundland and Labrador, when I became Premier, I was first out of the gate to announce, other than Quebec, $25 a day childcare. And then we worked with the federal government as they wanted to enhance and support their policy initiative, which I respect, to deliver $10 a day childcare. And so we worked with them. And we want to continue to work with them. But you do have to respect the constitutional lines that were drawn, and were drawn for a purpose.
Do you think the willingness to be collaborative is universal at the Premier's table? I mean, I look at the situation that's also playing out there today. Scott Moe is withholding federal carbon tax. You talk about respecting jurisdiction. He is refusing to collect and remit a federal tax for political reasons. So how do you overcome that when there's obviously friction there that goes beyond a simple plain reading of the Constitution?
Well, you'd certainly have to put that question to Premier Moe. I know he's quite capable of answering that question himself, and how he reconciles that difference. I'm sure he has a litany of arguments to support his position. But all I can speak to is Newfoundland and Labrador's position. And again, we want to work with, but we want to respect the boundaries. We want to respect the Constitution. We want to make sure that again, I'm repeating myself, but I believe Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and Canadians expect and deserve levels of government to work together, but respecting the jurisdictional lines that were drawn in the Constitution, which were drawn for a reason, so that there's clarity and certainty, and therefore achieves effectiveness and efficiency in delivering services.
Okay, I want to ask you about working with Quebec. I know you met with Premier François Legault while you're in Halifax, and I know there are high-level conversations going on between Newfoundland and Labrador and Quebec about the future of the Churchill Falls Hydro Project, the lopsided deal that expires in 2041. Has there been any progress made in your conversations with Premier Legault? Should we expect to see something on that soon?
Well, certainly, David, I've said to local media at home and will maintain on the national front, we're not going to negotiate in public. I will say that Newfoundland and Labrador has a strong position in this negotiation. For the first time, you would know, as a Newfoundlander and Labradorian who's well versed in this contract and the, not just the fiscal realities that it portrays in Newfoundland and Labrador, but the deep cultural impact that it has in Newfoundland and Labrador. We know that we're in a good position, and I will only do a deal that is in the best interests of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, that has the best returns for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. In this changing energy environment, we are blessed with a bounty of resources in Newfoundland and Labrador, whether that's on the non-renewable side, which we're fully committed to. Oil and gas is not a dangerous word in Newfoundland and Labrador. It's a series of words that we celebrate, but we also have a bounty of renewable resources. We know we have to have partnerships in that, and we're willing to entertain partnerships as long as it has the best return for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. We won't repeat the mistakes of the past, and I will ensure that we are on a steady and strong footing to make sure that, as I said in the past, someone shows us the money.
I appreciate that you won't negotiate specifics in public, but how would you characterize the direction of the talks? Have you made progress since they started? Are you more optimistic, less optimistic? Is there momentum there?
Sure, I would say this, David. If you look at the history of my tenure, one of the first visits that I took as Premier was to meet with Premier Legault, recognizing that in utility terms and energy terms, 2041 is actually today, so that it needed to have a healthy conversation about what opportunities could be achieved. The subsequent conversations led to Premier Legault coming to Newfoundland and Labrador in a very historic moment where the Premier of Quebec came to the people of Newfoundland and Labrador and essentially recognized that it was an unfair deal. And I would say from those conversations, from those continued dialogue at a principal level of the premiers and a negotiating team now, there has been progress made. Are we there yet? No. And as we continue to make progress, we can't forget and need to understand and continue to do, as we do on our negotiating team side, to update the Indigenous partners that would be impacted by anything that was done.
Okay, Premier, I have one last question for you. As the other Liberal First Minister in Canada, along with Premier Pillay, have you spoken to Justin Trudeau since the calls have been made for him to step down or reconsider his leadership? I know you worked on his leadership campaign a decade or so ago. What are your thoughts on the situation the Prime Minister finds himself in? What do you think he will do and should do?
Look, I've had the chance to speak to the Prime Minister. He was in St. John's on July 1st. We did not talk about his position. We did talk about, David, something that would be near and dear to your heart, the COD moratorium, and how we don't necessarily agree with their position on the COD moratorium. It's my belief that any changes in the quota can't allow for foreign trawlers to be off our shores. I mean, right now, the change that has been made to the COD allocations in Newfoundland and Labrador, the people who have nursed this resource back to health, back to being able to be fished for 5,000 extra tons. The NAFO treaties kick in. Guess who's a member of NAFO, the North Atlantic Fisheries Organization? Russia. So we cannot support in any way, shape, or form one cod tongue, one fillet, or one cod fish being harvested by Russian trawlers. It's just unacceptable. We can't sell them their oil, but we can welcome them into our shores to catch cod off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. It's unacceptable. But on the leadership question, look, the Prime Minister has rightfully earned the position to make whatever choice he makes himself. Those choices to enter and exit are very personal. He's won 3 elections. In addition to the leadership, and he has earned the right to make that decision, and I'd support him in whatever decision he makes.
Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Andrew Furey, thank you for your time today, sir.
You're welcome. Take care.